Hi everyone. Hi, my name is Brett Hancock, and so yeah, just continuing with my series of different videos that I'm coming out with. This is an introduction to a much more in depth, a much larger, longer video. That would be part two. I'm going to go in more in depth, but I just want to keep this one short, just introduction. If you like this one, I encourage it. Go and see the longer one that'll be coming out very soon, more in depth. But let's take a look at what the Bible says about divorce and remarriage. I mean, I'm telling you, it's amazing what the statistics say how there's as many Christians, quote unquote, getting divorced as there are people that don't even know Christ. So this is a really important topic. So let's take a look. There's seemingly no end of books, articles, websites, YouTube videos, Facebook discussion groups, forums, blogs, etc. on this topic. I mean, there's so much material out there. I mean, especially on YouTube, people can just be like their eyes spinning, rolling in the back of their head. It's crazy. Um, but in my experience, most people really are not looking for the truth. They're not hungry for the truth. But God has given us a conscience, and it burns in us. Sometimes we can't even sleep at night because there's certain things that are going on, and maybe you find out that wow, I've seen some scriptures that say that I've been divorced and remarried, or my spouse has been divorced and remarried, and it seems like the scriptures are saying that I'm living in adultery and I'm really sweating it. And so people just want to hear, a lot of times, not always, a lot of times they just want to hear somebody tell them something. They got respect for this theologian. They got respect for this pastor. Wow, this pastor has a mega church. He's got 10,000 people in his church, so he must be quote unquote fruitful, and therefore he must have God's approval. And so they're not really looking for truth. So I hope that you're looking for truth. So let's take a look at some stuff here. Okay, how about you? Um, Jesus said. I mean, this is one passage. Jesus said, "What will a person give in exchange for his soul?" I mean, that's something to really think about. Jesus said things like, "Unless you give up your father, mother, brother, sister, if you love them more than me," kind of thing. If you don't give up everything, you cannot be my disciple. This is the way Jesus spoke. Um, you know, Despite the modern gospel by so many groups that just make all you got to do is just believe in Jesus, believe that He died for you, and believe that He forgives you, and all this kind of stuff, and they really make it very different than what Jesus preached. So, when it comes to being married as a Christian, does God allow couples? To use Jesus' words, does God allow couples? God has joined as one flesh to have irreconcilable differences and therefore divorce. So we're not talking about couples that God did not join as one flesh. We're talking about those that He joined as one flesh. Does He allow them to divorce and separate? Irreconcilable differences is quite often the excuse that's put down on the paperwork and stuff. If they are one flesh couples joined by God, and again, we're not talking about the ones that aren't joined by God, and we'll take a look at that in part two and more in depth, but we're not going to look at a lot of that now. Um, so now that they're divorced, does He allow them to go on their own way, separated, unreconciled? I mean, just think about it. Does this make sense considering the gospel in general? What the gospel is about: forgiveness, reconciliation. And when we look at Jesus' words, like so many different places in the scriptures, like He says in the Sermon on the Mount, somebody's coming to bring their gift, to God. He says, leave your gift there, in the temple, and go and be reconciled with your brother, and then come back and bring your gift and bring it to God. Or in Matthew 18, where we show a picture of the servant that the king forgave, and the guy owed, in equivalent modern terms, millions of dollars, and he forgave him freely. And then the guy went out, and he had a friend of him that owed him $10, and he started strangling him, like, "Pay me back what you owe me." And of course, when this king found out, he reinstated his debt. And then Jesus warns us in Matthew 18 that anyone that doesn't do likewise and forgive as we've been forgiven. This is what the Lord's Prayer says in Matthew 6 and Luke 11. In both places, it's saying, "Forgive us our debts, our trespasses, our sins, as we forgive those who trespass against us." And so this is it. We're making the appeal to God in that prayer that if we forgive others, please forgive us. Right? This is what Jesus commands us to pray, because this is what God's going to do, whether we cooperate or not. So it's about reconciliation. It's about, if your brother repents, forgive him. Peter said, "Lord, how many times do I got to forgive, my brother who sinned against me? 7 times?" Jesus says not 7 times, but seven times, or 70 times 7, or there's different ways to interpret that, but basically Jesus is not talking about keeping count. He's saying, hey, man, just, endless. You got to keep forgiving. And just like we have, my Father and I have forgiven you, you must forgive. And so that's what the gospel is about. So does it even make sense? So just think about that. And if God does not allow this, again, hypothetically speaking, because we haven't looked at the scriptures yet, what would be the consequences of doing it anyway? So here you are, joined by one flesh as God. I mean, is there a key that unlocks this? I mean, what does the scripture say? When is a person allowed to actually separate from their spouse? I mean, does God allow you to just break that bond and go and be remarried? So does God allow for those that Jesus said in both Matthew 19 and Mark 10? They arguably the same account. There's a little different verbiage there, but you got two different authors recording the event. According to early church history, first couple hundred years, Mark's gospel was basically Peter's gospel, because John Mark traveled around with Peter, and in Peter's letters, he refers to John Mark, how he was, a blessing to him, and appreciated him. And so John Mark is traveling around with him. He started writing down Peter's sayings, and so that's what we have on record. That's what Mark's gospel is. It's really Peter's gospel, that have been joined as one flesh. And obviously in that passage we're going to look at it, Jesus is referring to Genesis 2:24. Does God allow that to become disjoined, to no longer be joined? If so, then does the New Testament say, how does he say that happens? When does that happen? Can man's government, in other words, is it, just throwing it out there, I don't know how well you know the scriptures, but according to the scriptures, what we see in the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles, and Jesus says that, he gives, for them, and has taught them, to give the words that God, the Father has given Jesus, the Son, to pass on. And so those that are sent, apostolos means one that is sent by Jesus. The book of Hebrews said that Jesus was the apostle of God the Father. He was sent by the Father. That's what that means. And of course we've turned it into a word in our language that seems to be like a special New Testament, vocabulary. And it's just somebody that gets sent by somebody. So that Jesus was the one that was sent by the Father, and Jesus sent these apostles, quote unquote, to bring the words of the Father through Jesus to the world, right? And so does it talk about death, being the sense of where this is broken? Is that the key that breaks the bond? Or can man's government be a judge, judicial sort of thing that is going to vary between countries and through the different generations and stuff? There's going to be variation. Does God give that kind of leverage? Does he give that kind of discretion to human beings to do? Or is it, no, here's the teaching I gave my son. It's from me, the Father. This is what I want. Stick to it. Do not differ from it. Do not vary from it at all. Obey what I say. Is that what we're talking about? Can remarriage after this judicial divorce, hypothetically speaking, if the Bible says that's okay, occur according to the Bible? Can remarriage? And if there is a distinction between, this sort of judicial sort of thing between the Old Testament and New Testament, what is that distinction? Is it same now under Jesus versus what God allowed under Moses? Okay, so we got a couple here. We end up, where they decided to break that bond, and now they got remarried. Some will argue that this issue is a one-time act, and that what is really the issue, this is what they'll say. I used to be a part of a church that made this, sort of argument. And back when I didn't know any better, I wrestled with this. And so, is it the marriage ceremony, the second marriage ceremony of the remarriage, that makes it a one-time act of adultery? Is that what we're talking about? Or is it the fact that they're one flesh? They're still joined, but now they go and join up with somebody else, shack up with somebody else, even though the government said it's okay. Is that what makes it adultery? What does the New Testament say about that? So yeah, this one-time act, this is what they'll say, those that argue this position, through the act of remarriage, which by forgiveness of Jesus, the Christian can then continue in that remarriage, even if the former spouse still lives. That's what they say. Because, hey, this one-time act, which was the marriage ceremony or whatever, they just, maybe there are different variations on that, but they'll say it's a one-time act and it's not perpetual, and so it's been forgiven. So is it the remarriage ceremony? Again, I already said that. Is Jesus' words one flesh, and what God has joined, let man not separate, shed any light? We're going to look at that. Mark 10 and Matthew 19, he says that. Okay. So again, this is the outline of what I'm going to have in part 2, much more in depth from what we're going over now. So let's just look at the scriptures. Jesus spoke about divorce and remarriage in these passages. Okay, so I'm going to go into what I meant by here. I got little notes on the side here. But first one we're going to look at is Luke 16, verse 18. Then we're going to look at Matthew 5, and then Mark 10, Matthew 19. Then we're going to look at what the Apostle Paul says, and we're just going to focus on these verses. In the part 2, the more in-depth one, we're going to look at the whole chapter. In Romans 7, 2 and 3, Paul is making a point as he's sweeping through the book of Romans. And all of a sudden he grabs a hold of what God's law is on marriage to make an analogy to show what's happening, this dynamic between human beings, and that was to a former marriage under the kingdom of darkness, that now set free through death, and now through Christ can be married to Christ. And so he's kind of making that analogy to show hey, God is on all these different levels. He's keeping the same pattern, the same sort of thing, so that we can do this. We can look at these different things and figure out what God's will is and shed light on the scriptures. And so we're going to look at this just specifically, even though it is an analogy to Christ and being unified with Him through death and everything, whatever, and just look at it specifically, the details itself of the law of marriage and how He's using that. We're not going to look at its purposes as a type of Christ, or typology or an allegory or any of this kind of stuff. We're going to just look at it literally. What is Paul saying about divorce and remarriage here? Because it really lines up exactly with verse 39 of 1 Corinthians 7. And of course, in some sense, it goes together with 10 and 11 as well. And then Hebrews 13 and 4, or chapter 13, which is the last chapter of Hebrews, verse 4, I think, is a little bit insightful there. So we'll look at that a little bit too. Okay, so let's get into it. So looking at Luke 16, verse 18 is where we're going to start. This is what Jesus said. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced from her husband commits adultery. So I highlighted this pink part because when we change to Matthew 5:32, we're going to look at 31 and 32. When we look at that, we're going to see this pink part is in common with that passage. This is what Jesus said: whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. That's what he says, And so here he's saying, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her is divorced. This is the third party man that comes along and says, oh, here's a woman that's available. Hey, let me marry her. Well, he's saying if she's divorced from her one flesh husband that God joined her with, that she's committing adultery. That he's committing adultery. So he's talking about the husband here. If he divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery. And here's this other man, this other potential second husband, commits adultery if he marries someone who's divorced, because she's still married with it, or still combined with this guy, still one flesh with this guy, according to God. Okay, so now we'll look at Matthew 5:31 32. Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her certificate of divorce. See, that's what Moses allowed. Now, we could go look at Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 3, and just kind of see this whole context and stuff. We'll do that in part 2. We're not going to do that now. This is what Moses said. This is what God allowed. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, this is what Jesus is doing. He's contrasting. This is what, before I came in the flesh, this is what I gave Moses. But I say to you now, because this is the desire of God. And he's going to shed light on that in Mark 10 and Mark 9 and Matthew 19. We're going to look at that. There he points back to Genesis chapter 2. And we see the big picture. But right now, we're seeing that Jesus is saying in contrast, but I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason other than this, sexual immorality, porneia, fornication, he's the cause. That husband that divorces her, if it's not for this reason, he's the cause. If she goes and gets remarried, he causes her to commit adultery, because he's putting pressure on her. She doesn't have nobody's supporting her, nobody's taking care of her. She's got kids. I mean, they're poor, they're struggling, and she's feeling the pressure. Man, I got to get married, man, because I got to survive. My kids are hungry, and so he's the cause of that, right? And then he goes on here. Now we could have made this into another verse, a different verse, because it's a separate thought. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. So this is what we saw over here. Whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. That's exactly the same phrase, right? So Jesus is consistent with that. This man, if he comes along and marries a woman that's been joined with one flesh with who God has joined, that man would then be committing adultery. So now let's look at Mark 10. Okay, so here's the teachers of the law. They're coming up. The Pharisees come to him and say, "Hey, is it lawful or is it permitted?" Actually, is a better translation because it doesn't actually use a word that has to do with law. But is it okay? Is it permitted for a man to divorce his wife? And he was testing them. The Pharisees were testing him, and he answered them and said, "What did Moses command you?" And they said, "Well, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her." Right? Well, that's what we saw back here. It says, "Further has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." So that's what Jesus is talking about. Moses, said this, and so the Pharisees are, that's what Jesus asked them, and they're saying, yeah, Moses permitted, and basically implication Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 3, permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her out of his house, to dismiss her. And Jesus answered and said the reason why God gave that to you, why Moses allowed that, why God allowed that, was because your hearts were hard. But from the beginning, now he's doing a contrast here, but in contrast, in the beginning it wasn't like that. God did not make a provision, did not make an allowance for hard hearts. God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother. For this reason, because he's made them, because what he's saying there. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined together with his wife. And this is what he's talking about. What God has joined, let no man separate. To be joined together with his wife. And the two shall become one flesh. This is Genesis 2, verse 24. That's what he's referring to. And they shall no longer be two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined, let no man separate, right? So this is what we're hearing here is, hey, is it permitted that, we can divorce our wives for any reason? And Moses, he said, what did Moses command you, or what did he permit you? And they said, well, hey, Moses permitted a man write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her. Jesus answered and said, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this precept, but I'm saying to you, what God has joined, let no man separate. See, he's a contrast here between what was formerly allowed in the old covenant, but now in the new covenant through Christ, it's like, nope, I'm doing away with that. I am not allowing hard hearts anymore, right? So this is the context of what we're talking about. Then when we come down here, in the house, his disciples also asked him. So this is after they separated from talking to all these, tempters of him who were constantly testing him and tempting him, trying to find an accusation to bring against him so they could stone him or put him to death. So here he is. He's just with his disciples, faithful disciples that have left everything. They're asking him. They're trying to learn because they're disciples. It means learner, right? Person that's a student, and he's the teacher. He's the rabbi, didaskalos in Greek, New Testament Greek. In the house, the disciples asked him again about the same matter, and so he said to them, "Anybody, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else, he commits adultery against her," right? Whoever divorces a wife, marries another, commits adultery against her. Now, whoever divorces his wife. Now here it says, for any reason except for porneia, causes her to commit adultery. So this is about the cause. So that's not saying the same thing. This is talking about a different, not topic, but a different angle of this whole divorce and remarriage issue. However, this passage is saying the same thing. Whoever divorces his wife, marries another, commits adultery. That's what that's what we're getting here. Whoever divorces his wife, marries another, commits adultery. And if the woman goes around and divorces her husband, now none of these passages, except for this one, talk this way. And there's all kind of arguments out there that I think are pretty decent, but the text doesn't say that. But it doesn't really matter. The point is here, Jesus is saying in Mark 10 here, if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So this is the reciprocal, this is the counterpart, this is the gender, just complete opposite, but the same principle. If she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. If he divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery, right? And so now let's go, let's see what I do with Matthew 19. I guess I must have closed it here. Alright, let's see, Matthew 19. Alright, let's bring this back over here. Okay, Matthew 19. Okay. Same account we just read in Mark 10. And the Pharisees came to him, testing him, saying to him, is it permitted or is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Just any reason? Anytime you see italics in the King James, other translations don't do this, but I give them credit. The King James, New King James does this. The italics is saying that this is not in the Greek, but we think that this is really what makes sense out of it to add these words. So they're good to do that. Divorce his wife. Is it permitted for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them in the beginning made them male and female? And he said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined with his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's what we just read in Mark 10. Same thing, right? So then, so he's saying, so I conclude, he's saying, so therefore, they're no longer two, but now they're one. They're no longer two, they're one. They're one flesh, right? So how can you take one? They're not two anymore. You can't just go and separate and go marry someone else. That's basically what Jesus is telegraphing that message. So you can't just go do that. Therefore, what God has joined, let no man separate. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give her certificate of divorce and then put her away? Jesus corrects them. He's like, he didn't command you, he permitted you. Moses, because of your hardness of heart, that's what we just read back here. Because of your hardness of heart. That's the reason why Moses, permitted her. They're saying commanded to do that in this particular passage. Because of your hardness of heart, he permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. It wasn't like that. And Genesis 2:24 is what he's pointing to, right? That's what he just talked about right here. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife. Now, this is the rendering of some manuscripts don't read this way. So I'm just going to, I'll go into more depth in part 2, but in this one, I'm just going to mention it. The oldest manuscripts we have don't have this exception clause in it, and so I'm just going to mention it. However, there is an old one that's 4th century, Codex Sinaiticus, that does read like this. So that's pretty much the exception. And then there's some that come a little bit later in the future that kind of rival some of the other ones that read the way that I'm going to present. And so my argument is that those ones are the ones that are really accurate. Now, another basis for my argument on that is that number one, the early church writings called the Ante-Nicene Fathers, they stem from the end of the 1st century all the way to about 325. So it's called ante. If you're Spanish, or if you know Latin, you'll know ante. Ante means before, and then Ante-Nicene. So the Council of Nicaea, the event that is very historical. Anybody that knows a little bit about, ancient church history, they know, hey, here's this event that happened in 325. It was a big deal about the Trinity versus Arianism and all this kind of stuff. So it's all the writings that go up to that point in time. And there's 10 volume set, and it's about like 3 or 4 feet wide if you were to buy all those. So just a big thing that would sit up on your shelf, and there's a ginormous amount of writing there from a lot of different early church writers. And none of them have talked this way about this. That would telegraph the message that they didn't have manuscripts that read this way. But these other manuscripts, like Codex Vaticanus and Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus and some of the other, I forget some of the other. There's a bunch of different ones I want to present in this other part too, that they don't read this way. Here's how they read. They read like this. They read just like this. Matthew 5:32. They say, "But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except for porneia, or sexual immorality or fornication, cause her to commit adultery." See, this rendering, it all stems on a single word. Moikatai makes it, if you say moikatai versus moikastheni, one of them is the infinitive that is in the passive sense, and one of them is, the active voice. It's not an infinitive, it's its actual verb. And so that's this one. It's saying that, commits adultery. But it doesn't say he or she, but because of the gender of how it's the ending and everything, you say, oh, well, that's talking about the husband. So it's saying that the husband commits adultery if she's not already guilty of porneia. So that's how just that word change makes all the difference in the world. Whereas if it's this word, moikastheni, then it causes her to commit adultery. See, this amount of word in English, it's all wrapped up into a single word. It's like, okay, they just kind of, one spelled it this way, one spelled it this way. It's like, okay, cause it, and it's huge. It's a huge difference. Well, here's the thing I want to mention, right? Around 300, somewhere around there, Eusebius did this amazing church history that theologian, there's so many things we know about the Bible because of what Eusebius did to record all the events from the time of Jesus, even before Jesus, all the way up to this period of time, right? Just to kind of catalog all the things that have been happening with church history. in there he mentions, and he's not the only writing that we have that say this. We have a disciple of John the Apostle, Papias, that also we have fragments of his writings. He says the same thing. And both of them say that, Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew. Now, some will argue, well, that's actually Aramaic. Well, for my point, it really has, who cares? It doesn't matter. The point is it was in this other writing for the Jews so they could understand. And then here's what Eusebius says in his early church history. He said, and everyone translated it for the Gentiles. They translated for the Gentiles. Everyone translated as best he could, right? That phraseology conveys the idea that in different regions that had the Hebrew, there were different people that they didn't start with one, and then Matthew translated in Greek. See, that makes that makes the book of Matthew unique from all the rest of the 26 books in the New Testament. Because with the other ones, we have the original writer putting it in Koine Greek, and then they propagate it into different regions and over the different timeline and stuff, or whatever. And so, we look at it from a different perspective of, well, what was the original rendering? Well, with what Eusebius sheds lights on, now we got various from this one Hebrew manuscript that might have also had a little bit of evolution too. Who knows? By the time it gets to the point where they started translating into Greek for the Gentiles. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, right? But let's just say, for argument's sake, it wasn't. It was the original Hebrew manuscript, and it ends up in some very different regions geographically. On the other side of the ocean, I live here in the United States. On the other side of the ocean, over there, that is modern day, Turkey and Italy and Europe and the whole Middle East and Northern Africa. That whole region over there. I mean, the writings were scattered, and they translated into Greek, as best they could. So it makes sense that some would translate that as moikatai and some would translate that as moikasthenai. Now, it might be because the one that did that might have not quite understood the Hebrew for them to pen it that way, right? Or they might have understood the Hebrew fine, but they just weren't really that good at Greek, and they penned it that way in Greek. It could be either reason, right? And so that's just something to think about. These ancient manuscripts we have read just, for Matthew 19, read exactly like this. And as I'm presenting with all these verses, and I haven't got to all of them yet, we're seeing that universally the New Testament is saying that when God joins as one flesh, and somebody says, you know what, for whatever reason, I'm going to ignore that, and I'm going to go marry anyway. Because, the local judicial laws says that I can do that. So I'm going to ignore God and I'm going to pay attention to human beings, right? Because Jesus just said it, what God has joined, let no man separate, right? And so for us to come along to Matthew 19, which it says that in Matthew 19, here's the context. Jesus is saying that. He's basically doing away with the allowance for the hardness of hearts, which Moses allowed them to have for a period of time. He's doing away with that. The context shows that. And yet here's one verse that seems to go against everything leading up to that point. And I present to you the reason for that is what I just said. Okay? This should read, I'm presenting to you, like Matthew 5:31 and 32. Okay? I've never heard of anybody present this theory, but I'm presenting it. And so I want you to think about that. And I'm presenting it. Anybody gets this, let it go viral around the YouTube. I mean, I want theologians, textual scholars to get this and really think about this. Now, here's the problem. For the same reason many people hear the teachings of Jesus and they couldn't accept it, and he only had 12 apostles, really 11 because one of them betrayed him, but he only had 12 followers. At one point, he had a ton of them, we see in the Gospel of John, and then when Jesus brought this really hard teaching to him in John 6, all of them except for the 12 left him, right? We see that in Luke, in Luke 10, I think it's Luke 10, where he sent out the 72. I mean, there was different times throughout Jesus' ministry. We had a ton of disciples, and then eventually at some point, people just couldn't take this radical abandonment call that he's calling people. If you don't give up everything, you cannot be my disciple. And people would leave him, and he only ended up with 12, really 11, right? And so, I contend that there's a lot of very sincere theologians that are out there that they can blow me away in Greek. They know Hebrew. I don't know Hebrew. They know so much, but maybe they're living in adultery and they don't. They're like the rich young ruler. They hear the words of Jesus and they turn away and they can't give it up. They just are not willing. And so I can tell you, for me, I was living an adulterous marriage. I had to walk away from a marriage. My marriage wasn't perfect, but you know what? There was that puppy love, that thing. I mean, it's the only marriage I ever had, but she had been married 2 times before. And so I had to walk away from that. It was heartbreaking, man. I mean, there was tears shed on the day that we actually did it at the court. But like I said, what God has joined, let no man separate, right? I'm going to put a little pregnant pause there. Implication being, what God has not joined, let man separate, right? Isn't that not what Jesus is saying? That's what we're talking about. Because if you go and remarry, if the man that remarries, this third party guy comes along and says, hey man, she's available, let me go marry her, he's committing adultery. If the man divorces his wife and then marries another, he commits adultery, right? And so the only passage we have, like we have Matthew 5:32, and I'm contending Matthew 19 verse 9 read this way, verse 32 does, and that, this is about the cause. Right here, this whole thing is that he will be to blame for her adultery if she's not already committing porneia, she's not already committing sexual immorality. He will be the cause of her adultery. It doesn't say if he remarries he won't be committing adultery. It doesn't say that. It's like people will read this over and over and over and they can't see it. It's like, open your eyes, man. Pay attention to what it says. This whole point is not about him remarrying. It doesn't even talk about that, right? I mean, this passage does in Luke 16. This passage does in Mark 10. But this one doesn't talk about the husband remarrying. It says if he divorces her, he will be the cause of her committing adultery. Because if she goes and gets married, like this guy comes along and scoops her up, he's going to be the cause of her committing adultery. And the other dude that married her is committing adultery as well. Yes, I said the word dude. I'm not a theologian, okay? I can use the word dude. So anyway, you know what I'm saying? I could go into this part here. I'm not. I'm going to stop right here and leave it, because in part 2 I'm going to get a lot more depth. But let me just leave it there. God bless you. Keep seeking truth. Jesus said in Matthew 7:21, only those that do the will of the Father are going to enter the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. Not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom. Only those that do God's will. That's the whole point of repentance. It's a change of mind. Metanoia means change your thinking, change your mind. It's not a one-time thing you do. Oh, I got saved. Oh, I did that already. No. Your whole life from then on has got to be a new life. That's why you're born again. Wiping out the old. The old man dies. You put it to death every day. Jesus said if you don't take up your cross daily and put that flesh to death, you cannot be my disciple. Whoever doesn't deny himself cannot be my disciple. All right. God bless you.